The Irene Cortez case, an unfortunate accident or a contracted murder of a mother of many. They say a scorned woman is capable of unpredictable and desperate acts, with cold and cruel revenge being the most fearsome. But what about a scorned man? Many would say an offended man might resort to physical violence, drown his sorrows in alcohol, or combine these two scenarios. Yet men, generally less grudge-holding, can be more ingenious when it comes to revenge. The case of Irene Cortez, a Spanish citizen who met a mysterious end during a trip to Colombia, is complex and ambiguous. While her perpetrators were caught, convicted, and are currently serving long sentences, the deceased woman's family claims the real culprit remains at large and is portraying himself as a victim. Let's delve into this intricate story from the beginning and try to determine if a third party was involved or if the murder was indeed unintentional. It's worth noting that each party involved is still trying to prove their version of the truth. Who was Irene Cortez? Irene Cortez, born Lucas, was born in 1980 in sunny Granada, Spain, the capital of the province of the same name. She grew up in a well-off family with a brother and sister. Her parents ran a small but profitable business. According to some reports, her father passed away early, but her mother, Maria Lucas, took over the business operations, expanded the enterprise, and ensured her children lacked for nothing. Maria's older brother, Uncle Pedro Lucas, was also a significant help. Irene was the eldest of the 3 children. A beautiful and sociable girl, she loved being the center of attention and attracted boys from an early age. Shortly after finishing school, she married and was already pregnant. At 17, she became a mother for the first time, and 2 years later, she had her second child. Her mother and uncle provided considerable support, allowing her to pursue a good education despite early motherhood. In the early 2000s, Irene moved to the resort city of Malaga with her husband and 2 children. There, she opened an entertainment venue that quickly became popular and profitable. Initially a small disco bar, it eventually transformed into a full-fledged nightclub. In Malaga, the couple welcomed their 3rd child, and life seemed prosperous and stable. At 25, Irene's husband was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison for trafficking illegal substances. Tragically, he lost his life in prison under mysterious circumstances. The responsibility of raising the children fell solely on Irene's shoulders. Remembering how her mother single-handedly raised 3 children, Irene was determined to persevere. She successfully managed her business, earned well, and had big plans for the future. Relationship with Farid Hennaceres. Farid Hennaceres, a native of Barranquilla, Colombia, was born in 1976. Growing up in a large impoverished family, he was the youngest of his siblings. His parents separated in the early 90s when he was still a teenager. His older siblings were independent by then, and Farid stayed with his mother. In February 2001, at 25, Farid, along with his elderly mother, moved to Spain in search of a better life. They settled in Malaga, where Farid took any job he could to support himself and his mother. In February 2005, he started working as a waiter at a nightclub owned by Irene. Irene immediately noticed Farid's hard work and reliability. She was also attracted to him, and Farid in turn did his best to please her. At the time, Irene's husband was incarcerated, and she planned to file for divorce but couldn't before her husband's untimely demise. Irene and Farid's employer-employee relationship soon blossomed into romance. Farid wasn't deterred by Irene's 3 children from previous relationships, nor was Irene bothered by Farid's humble background as a waiter whose salary she paid. Within months of starting their relationship, the couple decided to move in together. They settled in Irene's spacious apartment, and soon after, Irene became pregnant with Farid's child. They went on to have 2 children together. It's unclear if they were officially married, but Irene kept her first husband's surname, while the children born with Farid carried the Hennaceres surname. Imprisonment and infidelity. In February 2009, Irene's past seemed to repeat itself. Like her first husband, Farid was arrested for distributing illegal substances and sent to prison. Once again, Iran was left alone, this time with 5 children. Farid was sentenced to 3 years, but served only 1.5, being released early for good behavior and cooperation with the investigation. However, soon after Farid's imprisonment, Irina found solace in the arms of another man and lived with him for those 1.5 years. Farid learned of her infidelity only after his release. Understandably furious, he threatened Irene and her lover and almost attacked the man, narrowly avoiding another legal issue. Eventually, they resolved the matter peacefully. Farid forgave Irene for the sake of their children, and they resumed living together as if there had been no imprisonment or infidelity. Irene's relatives were always skeptical about Farid. Her mother and uncle disapproved of their relationship, suspecting Farid was only interested in Irene's money. Also, Irene's older children from her first marriage never accepted Farid, while the youngest, whom Farid had raised since the child was 2, saw him as a father figure. Fateful trip to Colombia. In early 2011, Irene's husband, Farid, expressed the need to visit his homeland of Colombia due to his father's severe illness. Reportedly, Farid's estranged father was diagnosed with advanced cancer, and his sister in Barranquilla had informed him of the dire situation. Irene, who had long wished to visit Farid's homeland, decided to accompany him. She was eager to meet Farid's father, whom she had never met, and also experience the legendary Barranquilla Carnival, typically held in late February. Moreover, Irene, who hadn't taken a vacation for years due to her dedication to work and raising her 5 children, saw this trip as an opportunity for a much-needed break. The couple planned a 10-day trip across the ocean with Irene's mother and younger sister agreeing to care for her children during this period. Despite her mother, Maria Lucas' attempts to dissuade her from the journey due to a bad premonition, Irene disregarded her concerns. At the same time, the family faced financial difficulties due to a seasonal downturn in their business. Despite this, Irene had personal savings of €3,000 in cash hidden at home. But on the eve of their trip, she discovered the money had mysteriously vanished, almost derailing their plans. Irene quickly borrowed the necessary funds from her uncle and close friends. She also booked their flight tickets and a hotel in the city center, thoroughly preparing for a journey that, tragically, would be her last. Mysterious murder. On February 27, 2011, the couple arrived in Colombia. The flight was uneventful, and they immediately checked into their hotel. Irene called home to reassure her mother. However, 2 days later, Farid informed Irene's eldest son, 14, of his mother's death. Initially, Farid claimed an accident, but it was soon revealed that Irene was murdered during a robbery at a Barranquilla entertainment venue. The case quickly became a major news story in Colombia. The narrative was that Irene, a Spanish tourist, was killed by robbers who fled the scene, triggering a citywide policeman hunt. However, the circumstances of the robbery and murder seemed unusual and suspicious. The attackers did not appear to be trying to steal anything, but instead shot Irene in the heart and then fled in haste. Police and local media representatives quickly arrived on the scene. Despite the fact that Farid witnessed the shooting of his partner during an interview with journalists, he looked quite calm, not corresponding to the image of a grief-stricken widower. The Spanish embassy in Bogotá confirmed the murder, adding that Irene's remains will be repatriated after the necessary investigations. The exact events of the night of March 2nd have yet to be clarified by investigators. In the meantime, authorities are actively pursuing the attackers responsible for this senseless crime. Surveillance footage. The case of Irene Cortez's mysterious death seemed to gain clarity after reviewing surveillance footage from cameras installed at the location where the murder occurred. On March 1st, Irene and her partner, Farid Genesaris, had planned to meet Farid's brother, his sister, and their spouses. The group of 6 enjoyed the carnival, walked around town, and then, at Farid's suggestion, went to a local bar for dinner and entertainment. By 1 a.m., Irene, Farid, and his relatives were the only customers at the bar, as surveillance footage clearly shows. Around 2 a.m., 2 young men sitting away from the group entered the bar. They did not order anything and did not look comfortable, which caught the attention of the bar manager because of their suspicious behavior. Moreover, their young appearance made the manager check whether they were of legal age. The young men refused to show their IDs, and when asked to leave, one of them pulled out a gun and aimed it at the manager. His accomplice produced a knife, but soon retreated out of the camera's view. The armed assailant pushed the manager aside and approached Irene's table, announcing a robbery and demanding mobile phones and cash. His knife-wielding partner reappeared, presumably to collect valuables while the gunman kept the group under threat. However, he didn't get a chance to act. Confronting Irene, the gunman ordered Farid to stand for a pocket search. As Irene reached for her purse, the assailant lunged at her with the same hand holding the gun. A shot was fired as he grabbed the purse, striking Irene directly in the chest. She collapsed to the floor as the assailants fled without taking anything. Farid and his brother chased after them while his sister tried to stop Irene's bleeding, and his brother's wife called for emergency services. Unfortunately, the culprits were too fast to catch. The men returned to the bar attempting to aid Irene, But it was too late. Emergency responders arrived quickly, yet Irene succumbed to her injuries en route to the hospital, leaving behind a baffling case and a grieving family. The hunt for the perpetrators, arrest, and trial. In the wake of the robbery and homicide that took Irene Cortez's life, law enforcement mobilized all available resources. The city was teeming with tourists for the carnival, and ensuring their safety was paramount. A reward of 10 million pesos, about 3,500 euros, was announced for information leading to the culprits. The first suspect, the gunman Brian Dario, was apprehended the next day. He quickly implicated his accomplice, Juan Carlos. Juan, 18, surrendered to authorities, hoping for leniency. During interrogation, Dario claimed dire financial straits, debts, and a sick child in need of costly treatment drove him to the crime, corroborated later by his relatives. He maintained that Irene's shooting was accidental, occurring while trying to snatch her purse. Juan Carlos contended he was an unwitting participant. He said Brian didn't reveal his plans, but asked for backup in a job. He claimed to have only a small knife for intimidation, not harm, and left the scene once he realized Brian's intentions. However, surveillance footage contradicted his claims, showing him returning to Brian. With both perpetrators in custody and their confessions, the case appeared solved, with prison sentences looming. The court found Dario guilty of robbery and homicide under aggravating circumstances, sentencing him to 23 years. Carlos received 17 for complicity in these crimes. Accusations against Farid and new crime details. From the early stages of the investigation, the family of the deceased woman openly accused Farid of orchestrating the murder of his wife. Irene's mother and uncle hired a detective who conducted an independent investigation, gathering additional materials and evidence to hold the man accountable and prove his involvement in the crime, starting with the earlier mentioned disappearance of 3,000 euros from the hiding place in Cortez's house. According to Maria Lucas, only Farid knew about this money, and he was the only one who could have discreetly taken it. The woman told her daughter about this from the beginning, but she did not want to listen. Now, she believed that her son-in-law used this money to pay Dario to kill his wife. Another weighty argument was the fabricated illness of the man's father, whom he was so eager to visit. It turned out that no cancer diagnosis was made for the elderly parent, and he was quite healthy for his age. Farid concocted this story, making it the main pretext for the trip to Colombia. Also, it was Janissaires who initiated the visit to that fateful establishment. Moreover, he insisted on continuing the feast deep into the night when all the other visitors had long dispersed, and their company was alone in the hall. Further, the detective conducted a detailed analysis of those very recordings from the cameras, giving an assessment of what was happening and making his own conclusions. He noticed that the criminals acted strangely. Juan was clearly scared and most likely really did not understand what was happening, while Brian approached the company, came up to Farid and raised him, but did not directly threaten him with a gun. It looked like the men knew each other and acted cohesively. Then Farid, strangely, moved behind Irene, who was sitting at the table. When she reached into her bag to get her wallet, the criminal with the gun looked at the man as if waiting for a signal. It's hard to say exactly whether he received any kind of sign, as the victim and her husband were back to the camera. After the shot, the man chased the killer, but in the expert's opinion, he deliberately let him escape. However, the latter statement can be considered controversial, as Brian was armed with a gun and Farid could reasonably fear for his life. Also in question was the man's behavior after his chosen one was declared dead. He willingly gave interviews to the arrived correspondents, talked about the details of what happened, and at the same time, did not look too upset or depressed. Another important question: why after the tragedy did Janissaires call not Irene's mother, not her uncle or any of the adult relatives, but dialed the number of her 14-year-old son to tell him about his mother's death? According to Maria Lucas, he wanted to personally inflict pain on the teenager, punishing him for not recognizing the stepfather's authority and treating him disrespectfully. The woman's uncle was the first to dare to give an interview in the press and openly talk about his suspicions and the results of the investigation. Pedro Lucas was sure that Farid planned the trip in advance, essentially luring Irene into a trap. The money stolen from her was used to pay for the services of a hired killer. And after her death, he planned to establish guardianship over the children and take over the business of his deceased wife. Farid's mother did not silently listen to her son being accused of a terrible crime and openly stood up for her offspring. The woman claimed that her offspring was madly in love with Irene and her children and would never harm her. However, in the end, the parent inadvertently let slip a phrase about the chosen one not having to cheat on Farid, as this greatly offended his pride. Also, An unpleasant detail emerged about Janissaires leaving Spain on fate documents, as he was not allowed to leave the country, because he had recently been released from prison on parole. The man himself denied this information, stating that he left legally, and Irene acted as his guarantor. Funeral. Without the widower. 12 days after the tragedy, Irene's body was returned to her native Spain. The funeral was conducted with a closed casket, as the remains had begun to decompose after such an extended period. Hundreds attended the funeral. Family, friends, neighbors, and even those who didn't personally know Cortez, but had heard about the resonance story and wanted to express their condolences to the family. The only person missing from the farewell ceremony was Farid, who simply feared returning from Colombia, apprehensive of retribution. Farid claimed that the relatives of his late wife had repeatedly threatened him and his elderly mother. For this reason, before flying back to Spain, he intended to appeal to the authorities to ensure his safety. He sought a protective order to be able to attend the funeral, but his request was denied, and Janissaires decided not to take the risk. In turn, Farid filed a complaint in court against the relatives of his deceased wife, who he alleged hindered his return home. However, Maria and Pedro Lucas denied his claims, stating they were most interested in his return to face trial in Spain. Additional court proceedings. With new circumstances and accusations against Farid, an additional investigation and court proceedings were conducted. Dario and Carlos, already serving their sentences in a Colombian prison, were interrogated about their acquaintance with Janissaires and a possible premeditated conspiracy. However, Brian categorically denied this assumption. He continued to insist that the murder was an accidental result of a failed robbery attempt. He claimed he had never seen Farid before, let alone been hired as a hitman for his wife. The accusations indeed seemed to be grasping at straws, with no irrefutable evidence of premeditation or a contract killing, only assumptions and interpretations of the events on the recording. Dario also confessed that he was under the influence of alcohol and prohibited substances that evening. Hence, his poor recollection of the event's chronology. As for Carlos, he maintained that his friend did not involve him in his plans, and everything that happened in the bar was as shocking to him as it was to those they attacked. Blon appeared to be telling the truth, but Brian's words, who made the fatal shot, raised some doubts. Consider this: he failed to commit the robbery, ended up in prison, but his sick child still received the necessary expensive treatment. Brian claimed that kind-hearted people learning about his motive helped him. However, the Lucas family's lawyers tried to prove that the €3,000 stolen from Irene, which Farid paid for her murder, were spent on the treatment. Supposedly, Brian agreed to sacrifice himself and go to prison to save his child and secretly pass the money to his wife. This version, however, was never proven. Returned to Spain. Only after obtaining a court order that guaranteed his safety did Janissaires decide to return to Spain. Several months had passed since the tragedy, and the media frenzy had subsided. Upon his return, Janissaires claimed to have brought investigation materials proving his innocence in his wife's murder. He cited his main reason for returning as a desire to care for the children he shared with Irene, who had been under the care of the deceased's relatives during his absence. 6 months later, Farid decided to give a major interview in which he revealed that he had lost virtually everything. He was jobless. His passport had been annulled, preventing him from leaving the country. And to add insult to injury, his friends had turned their backs on him, and the mother and uncle of his late wife forbade him from seeing his children. Janissaires repeatedly faced Maria and Pedro Lucas in court. He accused them of threatening him while they attempted to prove his involvement in Irene's murder. However, neither side could substantiate their claims. Ultimately, the children remained in the custody of their grandmother and uncle, and the widower was unable to claim any of his late wife's property. The case of the Foster family. To what many perceived as the perfect family, no one expected that everything would quickly descend into disaster. On August 26, 2008, around 4 a.m., the Shropshire Central Fire Control received an emergency call about a fire at the Osbaston Mansion residence. When the firefighters arrived, they were hindered by a large horse box that blocked the entrance. By the time they managed to enter the residence, due to the initial difficulties, the fire had already consumed everything, including the owners, the Foster family. During the investigations, the police discovered that the horse trailer blocking the entrance had been deliberately parked there to delay the firefighters. This was not just an accident. Something more sinister was behind it. The question arose, who harbored animosity towards this beloved family, and who could be responsible for their tragic demise. The disturbing footage recovered by the investigators from the security cameras provided the answers they sought, but also sent chills down their spines. This is the shocking case of the Foster family. Christopher Foster, who was destined for success, was described by his mother Enid as a proactive achiever who sought opportunities for financial gain from a very young age. He shared aspirations with his younger brother Andrew Foster of emulating their late father, who was a sales director, as they both wanted to be successful businessmen. However, despite their common goal, Chris and Andrew's relationship had always been strained since childhood. Andrew later revealed the difficulties in their bond, attributing it to childhood dynamics. Chris, who was perceived as more confident and self-assured, cast a shadow over his quieter and less assertive brother Andrew. Both siblings, however, maintained a close relationship with their mother Enid, who cherished them both, though harboring a special fondness for Chris. In 1987, Chris married Jill, a housewife who later gave birth to their daughter and only child, Kirsty. In 1993, Chris's journey to wealth and success in the late 1980s began when he worked as a salesman selling mattresses and cheap pizza boxes for insulation. However, his life took a transformative turn when he witnessed a news report, leading him to establish a prosperous engineering company. This venture ultimately propelled him to self-made millionaire status, thanks to the development of a groundbreaking insulation material that would be widely utilized in the oil industry. As a result of what he saw on the news, the Piper Alpha oil rig explosion on July 6, 1988, which resulted in a devastating fire lasting for days and claiming 167 lives. Chris astutely seized this tragedy as an opportunity, identifying a market for fire-protected insulation tailored to gas and oil rigs. Although several oil companies expressed interest, they demanded proof of the product's efficacy before committing to any contracts. To meet this requirement, Chris took a significant financial risk by mortgaging his house for £5,000 to fund a testing. The successful test where UltraShield, as he named it, displayed exceptional resilience compared to other oil rig installations that burst into flames and even earned a rare A1 fire test rate. Major oil corporations promptly placed orders, catapulting Christopher Foster into millionaire status almost overnight. Reports circulated that he was accumulating a substantial amount of money, which he did not know how to manage. As his business expanded, Christopher experienced a significant increase in annual turnover, soaring from £50,000 to £1 million, according to his personal assistant. It appeared that Chris was destined to spend a large sum of money. Although he allocated himself a monthly salary of £10,000, he was known to withdraw an additional £5,000 from the company's accounts for personal expenses. By February 2004, Chris's net worth was reported to be £10 million. During that same year, after a shopping trip, Chris and his wife Jill had returned home when Jill came across an exquisite mansion called Osbaston House while browsing through the pages of Shropshire Life magazine. This property, situated in the affluent village of Merbrook in Shropshire, England, covered an area of 16 acres and featured a private lake and riding paddocks. Despite the asking price of around £1,500,000, the Fosters promptly made an offer and quickly sold their own home to move to Osbaston House. After settling in, Chris invested an additional £50,000 in installing a swimming pool and landscaping the property. He then indulged in a lavish lifestyle, acquiring various expensive vehicles, including Porsches and Aston Martin and Range Rovers. Their daughter, Kirsty, was enrolled in an exclusive private boarding school, and Chris also bought her several horses. Additionally, Chris purchased 4 dogs and several doves and hired a housekeeper and a personal assistant. The house was adorned with over £200,000 worth of antique furnishings, which became Chris's most expensive hobby. Chris was an avid gun enthusiast, owning numerous high-priced firearms ranging from £12,000 to $12,500 or almost $20,000 at the time. He frequently participated in extended shooting parties, sometimes lasting up to 3 days, which resulted in bills as high as £8,000. Chris also had a habit of leaving his guns scattered around his residence and would occasionally shoot doves, much to his wife Jill's dismay, as it caused a mess on his cars. In one disturbing incident, Chris took Kirsty's black Labrador, which was bothering the sheep, to a country lane and shot the dog in the head. Despite being a thriving entrepreneur, Chris was characterized as impulsive by acquaintances, exhibiting a desire for instant gratification and swiftly severing ties with those who displeased or went against him. He derived satisfaction from others admiring him and coveting his material wealth. And over time, both Chris and Jill ascended to higher social circles. Unbeknownst to those in his circle, Chris was significantly exceeding his financial limits and compensating by withdrawing funds from the business. His excessive spending resulted in a financial imbalance with more money going out than coming in. In February 2003, Chris signed an exclusive contract with a company called DRC, granting them sole rights to produce the oil rig sealant he had invented. By February 2004, his net worth had risen to £1 million. But a year later, in February 2005, he found himself burdened with £2,800,000 in debt. Instead of implementing cost-cutting measures, Chris, consumed by his spending addiction, tried to address the issue by seeking additional funds from alternative sources. He proceeded to sign a second contract with another company for the sale of his product, breaching the exclusivity agreement with DRC. This led to legal action with DRC ultimately suing Chris and acquiring his patent, which they then made a global success. Chris faced bankruptcy, and in February 2007, his company went into liquidation with £3 million worth of his assets frozen, and his salary ceased. Despite being in dire straits, Chris persisted in carrying on as if nothing significant was happening, and he even found himself in a dispute with his accountant who reported him to the Inland Revenue for tax evasion. He failed to pay V8, national insurance, and other taxes. To address the growing tax obligations, he resorted to borrowing from banks in an attempt to alleviate the financial strain. Furthermore, he remortgaged the Osbaston house 3 times and overdrew from more than 20 different bank accounts. Despite his outwardly lavish lifestyle and continuous spending, Chris managed to conceal the fact that he was deeply in debt. Over the following 12 months, he continued his hobby of clay pigeon shooting and maintained his use of extravagant cars. People who knew Jill were uncertain whether she was aware of the full extent of her husband's financial troubles, or if he had shielded her from the harsh reality. However, she did not show any signs of reducing her spending, and she did not share any concerns with her friends. Chris found himself grappling with overwhelming challenges, aware that time was slipping away and fearing the imminent loss of everything. During a conversation with a friend about houses, Chris emphatically stated that he would never part with Osbaston House unless it was in a body bag. He expressed a solemn commitment to safeguarding his family, vowing to take his own life rather than endure the loss of his loved ones or possessions. Struggling with the pressure to maintain his lavish lifestyle and aware that time and money were running out, Chris sought professional help on multiple occasions. He confided in his doctor, expressing feelings of depression and suicidal thoughts. He started taking antidepressants, but his doctor did not take his concerns about ending his life seriously. Unbeknownst to anyone at the time, something unthinkable would happen in the week leading up to the August bank holiday weekend of February 2008. Chris stumbled upon a letter from his best friends attached to the front gate. The letter conveyed the unsettling news that his friends intended to return the following Tuesday to reclaim the house and other assets. When the housekeeper showed him the letter, Chris appeared perplexed, but remained silent. This letter would become the catalyst for the tragic events that unfolded later. The nightmare Chris had been evading was now becoming a harsh reality. Struggling with financial problems, he was on the verge of losing all his material possessions. And this impending ordeal was set to be known by everyone, something that he didn't really want. The thought of Kirsty and Jill, Chris's wife and daughter, losing their accustomed lifestyle proved unbearable for Christopher. Kirsty faced parting with her cherished horses, and the family had to face the likelihood of returning to their hometown of Wolverhampton, bidding farewell to their luxurious way of life. For a man of Chris's pride, such a situation would be deeply humiliating. On August 21, 2008, a friend reached out to Chris via text inquiring about his well-being, to which he responded, "Not good. Things are coming to a head for me soon." This communication was the only insight the friend received, unaware of the underlying financial troubles Chris was grappling with. On August 25, 2008, Chris received an invitation to attend a barbecue and pigeon shooting event. The 50-year-old man, accompanied by his 49-year-old wife and their 15-year-old daughter, then proceeded to join the gathering. None of the attendees noticed any signs of distress in Chris or the other 2 family members. Witnesses recall Chris appearing his usual cheerful self. And even in the photo captured during the event, the family exuded happiness, oblivious to what Chris had planned for later that night. In the previous week, Chris had closely examined suicide-related websites online and had spent the same afternoon reflecting on old family photographs that depicted happier times. Expressing his wish to leave the party, Chris informed his wife that he had had enough for the night. Although Jill preferred to stay a bit longer, they eventually departed around 8:30 p.m., arriving home just minutes later at 8:44 p.m. with their final moments as a family recorded by the home's security footage. Shortly after Jill retired to bed at 11:30 p.m., Chris went upstairs to check on Kirsty, urging her to go to bed as she continued texting a friend online. Around midnight, Chris decided to turn off the internet, compelling Kirsty to conclude her conversation with her friend and retire for the night at 3 a.m. Chris set out to kill his first victim using a silenced gun. He entered the room where his sleeping wife lay unsuspecting and shot her in the back of the head. He then went to Kirsty's room and killed her in a similar manner. The home security cameras captured Chris as he took one of his shotguns and went outside to the dog kennels, where he shot each dog in the head. Chris then made his way to the barn housing the horses and repeated the same sinister act. Following this, he set the barn ablaze with all the animals inside. In the footage, Chris appeared methodical and almost robotic, lacking any expression or sign of remorse. To hinder the firefighters' access to the residence and their efforts to extinguish the fire on time, Chris took action. He drove a horse box and positioned it in front of the main entrance, shooting the tires to deliberately puncture them and make it harder to move. Subsequently, he strategically placed hose pipes connected to his domestic oil tank, pumping 200 lils of oil into the house's cellar. With his expertise in fire, Chris knew exactly what was needed to completely destroy the Osbastian house. His mental state seemed rooted in a desire for vengeance. If he couldn't retain his material possessions, then no one else should either. Chris then proceeded to set the house on fire, dousing his cars and other belongings with the flammable liquid as well. The fire quickly and violently consumed everything. Still armed with a rifle, Chris returned to the house and headed to the bedroom where Jill's lifeless body lay. There, he lay down beside her, embracing his deceased wife amid the flames that consumed everything. Chris's distant brother, Andrew, speculated that Chris might have wished for the fire to consume him as punishment for his actions that night. It was reported that Chris died due to smoke inhalation. The autopsy found no evidence of gunshot wounds, even though he had a rifle near him. At around 4:11 a.m., the security cameras had stopped working. A concerned neighbor called emergency services after seeing the flames growing. Firefighters quickly arrived at the residence, but were delayed by a horse box blocking the main gate. By the time they cleared the obstacle, the fire had already grown to an intensity that made it difficult to bring under control. As firefighters battled the raging blaze, neighbors watched in horror as the estate was consumed by flames, expressing deep concern for the now missing owners, the Fosters. In the subsequent days, newspapers and TV stations issued appeals to locate the family, but their efforts yielded no results given Chris's affluent status. Authorities initiated an investigation, initially suspecting a criminal abduction of the Foster family. At this point, however, neither the bodies nor the security camera footage had been discovered, and so many had speculated that this was what had happened to them. The arduous task of extinguishing the flames spanned 3 days. Finally, investigators cautiously entered the remnants of the house and discovered the intertwined remains of Jill and Christopher. Their bodies were bound together, laid on the bed in a room that had collapsed down to the living room area, where they were eventually found. However, there was no trace of Kirsty, amidst hopeful speculation that she might have escaped, while others feared the possibility of her abduction. A few days later, heartbreak ensued as small fragments of Kirsty's remains were discovered amidst the debris. Investigators, employing delicate precision, used brushes to gather Kirsty's remains into a waiting hearse. The discovery of a piece of Kirsty's skull revealed that tragically, she had suffered a gunshot wound to the head, just like the fate that had befallen her mother. Upon recovering and scrutinizing the bodies, the police directed their suspicions toward Chris as the likely perpetrator of the crimes. Concurrently, an investigation into his financial affairs was initiated. The deeper they delved, the more revelations unfolded about a prosperous businessman who was in reality submerged in insurmountable debt. To everyone's surprise, Chris's accumulated debts had amounted to £4 million. As creditors sought to claim his assets, they discovered that Chris had meticulously ensured there was nothing left for them. With the retrieval of security footage, the police confirmed their suspicions. Chris had carried out the murders and his own demise, leaving no note or indication of what he was going through. Speculation arose about the dark motives behind such a brutal crime, with the prevailing theory positing that Chris, consumed by shame over losing his fortune, opted for the heinous act to evade admitting his failures. Others suggested it was the defiant act of a self-centered man who chose to obliterate everything before facing the prospect of loss. Enid struggled with the distressing news as did everyone else, but she adamantly rejected the notion that Chris could be capable of such actions. She staunchly defended him and harbored considerable sympathy for him, believing that Chris committed the acts out of love for his family, aiming to protect them from losing everything. However, Chris's brother Andrew held a contrasting viewpoint. Having not spoken for 16 years, there were fleeting thoughts of reconciliation for the sake of their mother. But fear restrained Andrew from going to his brother's house with apprehensive thoughts of encountering a potentially hostile situation. Andrew asserted that Chris bullied him during their childhood and had even allegedly sexually assaulted him. This tumultuous history led Andrew to maintain silence for the 16 years. According to him, Chris exhibited traits of a bully and control freak. In response to Andrew's 1999 letter, Chris replied with a note demanding a written apology, adding that Andrew would need to beg and scrape on bended knee to come to him and Jill. Andrew contended that Chris was unwilling to acknowledge his wrongdoings and instead harbored long-standing grudges. For months after the devastating tragedy on December 19, 2008, the funerals for 15-year-old Kirsty and 49-year-old Jill took place at their local village church. The joint funeral was silent and respectful, attended only by a small gathering of intimate friends and family. Both were laid to rest in the same plot. Following the wishes of Jill's family, Chris had a separate funeral and was interred away from Kirsty and Jill. In the years subsequent to the tragedy at the Osbaston house, remnants of the scorched structures and the family's charred belongings, including Kirsty's cherished first aid book for her horses, and even a handwritten note outlining what the family had planned to eat during that week of the tragedy, still lingered on the site. The once dream home, now reduced to crumbling ruins, persisted until 2011, when all debris was cleared. The 16-acre estate was eventually purchased in 2014, with plans formulated for the construction of a new 6-bedroom house. Although the property was put up for sale in 2012, it remained unsold until 2014, after the price was said to have been reduced. While the motives behind Christopher Foster's shocking deeds may have stemmed from financial struggles and the societal pressure to uphold an affluent and successful facade, it definitely shouldn't have taken such a horrific turn. Tragically, rather than making prudent financial decisions initially or later confiding in his loved ones about his financial woes, Chris chose a path of self-destruction with devastating consequences for all involved. As we reflect on this heartbreaking case, our thoughts are with the victims whose lives were tragically cut short and the loved ones they left behind. The case of Nicole Lobby. Nicole Lobby, 29 years old, lives with her husband Chris and has a large family in Oregon, USA. Nicole was a beautiful woman, loving wife, amazing mother, and a friend. All she was not afraid to share her faith or her opinion with anyone. Her goal was to make sure that she left this world a better place. When Nicole met Chris, she already had an older daughter. Chris also had 2 daughters, and after they got married, they had a son. Nicole is known for being adventurous, brave, and always looking forward. She overcame a rare cancer and then became very passionate about fitness. Nicole's goal is to become a fitness trainer. Nicole recently started a new job and no one thought she would be in danger at work. At about 5 p.m. on August 19, 2014, Portland Emergency Services received a call from a man reporting that a woman had been stabbed in the chest. The victim was still alive but had difficulty breathing. So the witness requested that an ambulance be sent to Timber Creek Apartments as soon as possible. Police quickly arrived and spoke with the man who called 911, who gave more details about the incident. He said he and his wife were walking down the stairs of their apartment building to the parking lot when they heard screaming. He turned to his right and saw a woman running toward them, screaming, "He stabbed me, he stabbed me." She told the couple she didn't know the attacker, but he was wearing camouflage pants and a black hoodie. The manager of Timber Creek Apartments identified the victim as Nicole Lobby, 29, a coworker. Nicole was a leasing consultant and had been working there for several weeks. On August 19th, during her work hours, she drove a trolley around the complex delivering letters asking for lease renewals. Along with each letter, Nicole gave each resident a balloon tied to a bag of popcorn. When she was done, she marked each apartment on a map in the trolley. Based on Nicole's notes and the map, detectives determined that the attack may have occurred on a specific stairwell in Timber Creek at the time residents heard Nicole screaming. The attacker may have been waiting for her under the stairwell. There was also a trail of blood from the stairwell and flyers scattered at the bottom of the stairs. During the Washington County Sheriff's Office investigation, several witnesses reported seeing a suspicious young man wearing a black hoodie and camouflage pants near Timber Creek at the time of the attack. Combining the reports and the timing of the sightings, Detectives determined the suspect's route through Timber Creek. More than 20 officers were involved in this intensive investigation, assisted by K-9 dogs. The Washington County Search and Rescue Team searched the woods along Cedar Mill Creek, a stream that runs through the Timber Creek residence. During the search, they found several items that were sent to a lab for analysis. Detectives did not disclose the exact findings, but said they were investigating every possibility. Investigators are trying to figure out what caused the attack, which took place in broad daylight at an apartment complex with more than 1,000 residents. They have contacted Nicole's husband, Chris Lobby, and informed him of the incident. The police took several steps to identify the attacker. It was not a robbery, and the attacker did not attempt to remove her clothing. This suggested that the motive for the murder might have been a personal dispute. This theory led detectives to her husband, Chris. Chris cooperated with the police and answered questions about his 4-year marriage to Nicole. Investigations revealed that he was at daycare picking up his son at the time of the attack. Therefore, Chris could not have been the attacker. Meanwhile, while interviewing residents at Timber Creek Apartments, the police found 2 more witnesses who saw a man wearing a black hoodie and orange pants. They saw this man, who had similar features to the suspect, running across the street without looking back. Around the same time the attack on Nicole took place, a hooded man was seen running toward the houses across from Timber Creek Apartments. Detectives working with witnesses drew up a sketch of the suspect and quickly circulated it throughout the city, even appearing on television news. The city urged anyone who recognized the familiar facial features to report the incident. Detectives also worked with informants to find clues about the killer. The sketch led to several leads. A man said his son knew a man who matched the sketch. His name was Taylor, and he had recently threatened others with a knife. Police found Taylor and brought him in for questioning. Taylor said strange things and seemed to have mental problems. When asked about Nicole, he did not hesitate to admit that he had killed her. However, Taylor's testimony was inconsistent, as he only mentioned information that had already been in the newspaper and gave irrelevant details. As a result, the police eliminated him as a suspect. After the sketch of the suspect appeared in the newspaper, the police received a tip about a man named Nick who had a criminal history. Nick looked similar to the suspect in the sketch. However, he had never done anything similar to what happened to Nicole. He had run-ins with the law before, but he had never physically harmed anyone. The police interviewed Nick and found his behavior disturbing. When asked about Nicole and the crime, he denied any involvement and asked for a lawyer. The police then obtained a search warrant for Nick's home. They found a black hoodie and orange pants, but the hoodie did not match the witness description because it had a bright white logo on the front. Nick's clothes were sent for analysis, but no evidence was found linking him to the crime. Nick's phone records also showed that he was not near the scene of the attack. As a result, the police eliminated Nick as a suspect, and the case went cold. Nicole's family is going through a very difficult time. In an interview with reporters, Chris Lobby shared that he can't stop thinking about what happened to Nicole. He said, "The hard thing is that there are so many unanswered questions. I keep thinking about what happened, different scenarios, and there are no answers to any of them." Police were concerned that the perpetrator might strike again, and their worries became a reality. 3 weeks after Nicole's death, on September 13, 2014, the Eugene Police Department received an alarming call. Eugene is a city about 100 miles from Portland. On that day, a resident was attacked while leaving a bar near Autzen Stadium. Heather Miller, 39, had gone to a bar near the stadium to watch the game. Around 8 p.m., when the game ended, Heather decided to go home. The streets were almost deserted. As she left the bar, she tried to call a taxi but realized her phone was dead. So she decided to walk closer to the stadium to catch one more easily. As she walked along the sidewalk, she noticed someone following her. As she crossed the street and turned around, she saw the man behind her was still following her. She walked faster but was suddenly hit in the back of the head, knocking her unconscious. When she woke up, she found herself face to face with her attacker, who had pulled down her pants in an attempt to sexually assault her. Heather tried to reason with her attacker. She said she had a daughter and begged to see her again, but he continued to beat her. Heather described that every time she spoke, she was punched in the face. Eventually, Heather realized that the only way to survive was to pretend to be dead. She closed her eyes and remained silent. When the attacker thought he had achieved his goal, he ran away. Despite the brutal beating, Heather found the strength to stand up and go out into the street. A minute later, a car stopped and the driver called 911. An ambulance arrived and rushed her to the hospital. Heather regained consciousness and spoke to a detective who arrived shortly afterward. At this time, Neither of them knew that the attacker had been arrested at the police station. There was a park near the scene of the attack. A police officer on duty that night saw a man running, stopped him, and saw that his hands and shoes were bloody. The police arrested him and called a patrol car to take him to the station. Jamie Tinoco, 17, was young but had been noticed by the police many times. At the time of his arrest, he was on probation for illegal possession. Jamie had been using drugs since he was 12, and his parents had no control over him. Jamie had dropped out of high school since his freshman year and was arrested for driving without a license the day before the attack on Heather, but was released shortly after. During questioning, Jamie confessed to attacking Heather. The man was completely calm and nonchalant, believing he had done nothing wrong. His actions led the Eugene Police Department to suspect that Heather was not his first victim. Police released his photo, hoping that other women affected by him would come forward. Soon after, detectives investigating Nicole Lobby's death saw a photo of Jamie released by Eugene Police. They believed Jamie matched the sketch of the suspect they had. Further investigation revealed that Jamie lived with his parents in Portland and that their apartment was across the street from Timber Creek, which further fueled their suspicions that he was involved in Nicole Lobby's death. Detectives questioned Jamie about Nicole's case, hoping that he would admit to assaulting her as he had confessed to attacking Heather Miller. However, Jamie insisted that he had nothing to do with Nicole's death and refused to answer questions. Police needed to find evidence to link him to Nicole Lobby's death. As mentioned earlier, Jamie lived across the street from his parents at Timber Creek Apartments. As a result, the police obtained a search warrant for his parents' apartment. They found a black hoodie and orange pants in Jamie's room and sent them to a lab for analysis. However, the lab results were disappointing, with no trace of Nicole's DNA on any of Jamie's belongings, and the investigation seemed to hit a dead end. While there is no evidence to prove that Jamie killed Nicole, there is enough evidence to link him to the attack on Heather Miller. He did not deny his actions and seemed proud of being a young thug. At his trial in connection with the attack on Heather Miller, he smiled and said he had no remorse for his actions. Jamie had broken away from a group of delinquent teens on a trip supervised by the Washington County Juvenile Department. He followed Heather, attacked her from behind, and dragged her into the bushes near Atson Stadium. Heather said she still has nightmares and flashbacks and chipped her front teeth after the attack. She has had to find a new job. The injuries she suffered in the attack, including a broken nose, required reconstructive surgery to recover. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about what happened, she said in Lane County District Court. I pray that Jamie will never have the opportunity to do this to another person and impact their life the way he impacted mine. Heather Miller held hands with two family members as she sat with more than a dozen supporters before reading her statement aloud. Jamie grinned in court as the victim recounted the horrifying details of the attack she endured. When the judge asked why Jamie was smiling, he replied that he did not know. The judge called Jamie's lack of remorse appalling and labeled him a danger to the community, then imposed the maximum sentence. Heather, comforted by friends and family after the hearing, said his behavior was disrespectful and unrepentant and the judge's sentence was fully deserved. A courageous mother of two, Heather pleaded with the judge that Jamie would never have the opportunity to harm another person. She did not want him to think he had won and brought her down, so she kept her composure from the start. Although the defense tried to portray Jamie as a young man who had been affected by substance abuse for years, the judge noted that his behavior in court clearly reflected character issues. Jamie's lawyer asked the judge to sentence his client to 8 years and 4 months in prison, arguing that Jamie was remorseful for what he had done. However, Jamie did not apologize when the judge allowed him to speak. He refused to make any statements. Judge Deborah Voigt sentenced Jamie to 14 years and 2 months in prison, explaining that his lack of remorse justified the harsh sentence. The community needs to be protected from a dangerous man like this, she said. As much as people want me to see him as a boy, I can't. When Jamie becomes eligible for release, he will be in his early 30s and will have to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life. As for Heather, her family said she is looking forward to starting a new job and being able to move on with her life. Meanwhile, investigators decided to take advantage of Jamie's ego to get him to confess. They questioned him about Nicole Lobby's death. The detectives told him that he would get more respect in prison if the other inmates knew that he was not only the coward who attacked one woman from behind but also the one who killed another. After a few minutes of silence, Jamie began talking about Nicole, saying that he didn't mean to kill her. He wanted to feel the sensation of stabbing someone, but he didn't mean to kill Nicole, just hurt her. He said that when he was walking from his apartment to Timber Creek, he saw Nicole park her car and bring a balloon to her second-floor apartment. As Nicole climbed the stairs, he hid behind the car, then ran up the stairs and stabbed Nicole when she turned around. Jamie said he chose Nicole because he thought she would be an easy target. When asked if he would try to force Nicole to have sex like he did with Heather Miller, he casually replied, "Oh, I've thought about it. I would." Jamie said he didn't do it because Nicole screamed when she stabbed him, so he ran away during the reenactment. Jamie showed investigators how he escaped the scene. Chris Lobby said he was shocked to learn that his wife's killer was only 17. "I have a 13-year-old daughter," he said. "It's unbelievable and hard to understand that someone 4 years older than her could do this." The trial began in 2015. Despite confessing under questioning, Jamie has pleaded not guilty in court. His attorney argued that there was no DNA evidence linking him to the scene. "I'm just asking for leniency for a 17-year-old boy with a serious mental illness who has the potential to change with treatment," defense attorney Robert Axford said. The defense's only witness was a psychologist who evaluated Jamie and determined he had symptoms of schizophrenia. However, a psychologist at Oregon State Hospital determined that Jamie had a personality disorder, not schizophrenia. His video confession and reenactment convinced the jury of Jamie's guilt. During his reenactment, he described details that only Nicole Lobby's attacker would know. During the sentencing phase, the jury had two options: life in prison without parole or life in prison with the possibility of parole in 30 years. The jury determined that there were no mitigating circumstances sufficient to impose a life sentence with the possibility of parole in 30 years. As a result, in 2017, Jamie Tinoco was found guilty on all counts. Jamie, then 20, stood in the Washington County courtroom between his two attorneys when Court of Appeals Judge Kirsten Thompson asked him if he had anything to say before she formally sentenced him to life in prison without parole. He put his hands down in front of his waistband, his mouth twitching slightly. "I beg for forgiveness," Jamie said before sitting down. Chris Lobby, Nicole's husband, said Jamie's family came to see his family after the sentencing to express their condolences and apologize. But that's not the end of the story. In 2021, the Oregon Court of Appeals overturned Jamie's 2017 conviction. Juvenile law has changed since Tinoco was tried on a Measure 11 charge. Under the new reform, offenders between the ages of 15 and 17 are no longer automatically sent to adult court. The new law requires prosecutors to hold a hearing to decide whether juveniles charged with serious crimes should be transferred to adult court. If the case is retried, Jamie's attorneys could ask for a lighter sentence. The decision to overturn the conviction came as a shock to Nicole Lobby's family, who were not expecting it. Nicole's father, Rich Jones, said they will have to go through another emotional ordeal. Jamie remains in prison, but this is not the end of Nicole Lobby's case. The case of Catherine Wellsbur. Catherine Wellsbur was born in 1989 in the United Kingdom to parents Phil and Jane Wellsbur. She has an older sister named Lynn. In the February, Catherine met Rofel Novak, a 31-year-old coworker, on a university break while working on a new vacuum cleaner production line. Rofel was an immigrant from Poland with a previous marriage and a son, had moved to England 4 years earlier seeking a better life. Rofel and Catherine started dating, initially meeting for lunch at the production site cafe, but soon progressing to romantic dinners. Rofel showered Catherine with gifts, took Catherine to movies, and went on walks with Catherine. As their relationship deepened, Rofel shared his past and reasons for moving to the UK with Catherine. Rodel's trustworthy nature allows her to open up completely to him. Within a few months, Catherine introduced Rodhel to her parents, who welcomed him into their family and hoped for Rodhel and Catherine's future happiness. Soon, Rethlis and Catherine began planning their wedding. Catherine graduated with honors from Bath Spa University in February 2011 and secured a promising job as a business analyst at Pneumatic International, the manufacturer of Henry vacuum cleaners. Her career progressed quickly, helping her have good job opportunities. Catherine is smart, highly educated, and has good interaction skills with others. She shows genuine interest in her co-workers' problems and cares for those around her. Her kind demeanor and radiant smile have earned her the admiration of her colleagues, who view her as a young leader. Catherine's career was advancing swiftly, and her substantial earnings, combined with those of her partner Rofel, allowed them to purchase a spacious home with a terrace in Willow Way. Although they were financially secure, they opted to take out a mortgage, securing insurance coverage as per their agreement with the bank. With their youth, successful careers, and love for each other, it seemed they had all the ingredients for happiness. However, the fateful day of September 12, 2012, marked a turning point in their lives, changing everything forever. On September 12, 2012, Orlando, a local resident, was driving home after a night shift at the gas station. He is in a hurry to take his daughter Maria to kindergarten as he promised his wife. While driving, he noticed black smoke coming from a nearby parking lot after turning a sharp corner. Smoke billowed from a car engulfed in flames. Orlando stopped and tried to get a closer look but couldn't due to the intense fire. When firefighters arrived 4 minutes later, the car was completely burned out. The police cordoned off the area to keep onlookers away. The location was relatively deserted due to the early hour, and there were no witnesses to the incident. Upon investigation, a charred body was found. The police needed to identify the victim and determine the cause of death. There were no signs of a car accident or any evidence of another vehicle being involved. The police initially suspected that the car may have caught fire due to a malfunction or self-ignition. A thorough investigation was conducted, involving multiple expert analyses. The remains were sent to a forensic laboratory to determine the identity and cause of death. The police also examined fragments of the burned vehicle to identify any malfunctions and establish the cause of the fire. The police began by checking the missing persons database and recent reports of disappearances. They quickly identified the deceased as 23-year-old Catherine Welsbar. On the same day, Rofel Novak filed a missing persons report for his girlfriend, Catherine. According to Rofel, he left for work at 5:30 a.m. while Catherine was still asleep. When she failed to show up for work, and Rafel couldn't find her at any of her relatives' homes, he contacted the police. The investigation involved interviewing the victim's family, including her parents and sister, as well as Rofel, her colleagues, and friends. By gathering information about the last days and years of Catherine's life, the police were able to reconstruct the events leading up to her tragic death. The investigation into Catherine's disappearance continued to uncover shocking details about her life with Rafel. As the truth began to emerge, it became clear that their relationship had been built on lies from the start. A 29-year-old man from Poland had left his wife and child behind to escape his debts. He moved to the UK, where he met Anna Levick, with whom he had a long-term relationship starting in February 2008. When Raphael met Catherine, he initially maintained relationships with both women. However, he eventually chose Catherine, believing she offered more stability and financial security. Catherine, unaware of Rofel's true intentions, genuinely desired a happy marriage and family with him. Meanwhile, Rofel was secretly planning to kill Catherine. Intending to use the life insurance payout in the large house they shared to find a new life with his mistress, Anna. The murder was carefully planned and executed with exceptional cruelty. On the day Catherine went missing, Rofel waited a few hours before reporting her disappearance to her boss, pretending to be frantically worried about her whereabouts. He feigned panic and despair in front of Catherine's colleagues and relatives, claiming she had been receiving threatening letters from a mentally unstable admirer. When Catherine's car was found missing and she was not at her parents' home or her own, Rofel's fake concern led Catherine's family to contact the police. Rofel recounted that the evening before her disappearance had been normal evening. Rofel and Catherine went for a walk, bought groceries, had dinner, watched TV, and went to bed together. Catherine seemed calm. However, a thorough investigation revealed that her death occurred earlier. She was strangled around 2 a.m., likely in her own bed while asleep. Her body was placed in the car, driven a short distance, and set on fire to destroy evidence. Rofel Novak had a solid alibi as he was at work from 5:30 a.m. He claimed Catherine was asleep in bed when he left. The burning car was discovered between 6 and 7 a.m. However, Rofel was still at home at 1:30 a.m., which significantly altered the case's direction. As a result, Rofel Novak became the prime suspect in Catherine Welsbar's murder. The evidence allowed for Rofel to be detained pending further investigation. Rofel claimed that Catherine was being stalked, which had caused her significant distress. However, during the investigation, it was discovered that Catherine had a secret online life. She had accounts on several adult websites, where she shared intimate photos and engaged in flirtatious conversations with men. A letter from a secret admirer was also found. Despite attempts to mislead the investigation, evidence was uncovered that proved Rafel's direct involvement in Catherine's demise. Notably, Rofel had a motive to kill Catherine. Investigators found that he had been in continuous communication with Anna Legwinowicz, and they had met regularly over the past few months. Furthermore, it was discovered that Reflis had a financial motive. Shortly before Catherine's death, they had both taken out life insurance policies worth £123,000. Rofel and Catherine were the sole beneficiaries of each other's policies, meaning they would receive the payouts in the event of the other's death. The main motive behind Catherine's death and the burning of her car to mislead the investigation was found to be a large life insurance payout. On the day she went missing, Catherine sent a message to Anna's phone. Additionally, security cameras showed Anna and her uncle filling a gas can at a gas station a few days before the crime. This new information brought a third person into the investigation. Anna Ladvinovic, 32, and her uncle, Tadeusz Dimitrisen, 38, along with Rafał Novak, are suspected of being accomplices in a premeditated crime and arson to cover up evidence. The crime was carefully planned by them over several months. They created accounts on adult websites, uploaded doctored images of Catherine, and created chats with various men to mislead the investigation. When faced with undeniable evidence, Rafał and Anna couldn't deny their involvement any longer and began blaming each other. Rafał claimed that Anna, driven by jealousy, planned and carried out the crime to eliminate Catherine. In contrast, Anna accused of committing the crime out of greed, seeking to secure the insurance payout for the house. To avoid detection, the conspirators forged much evidence related to Catherine. They created fake profiles about Catherine on dating websites, portraying her as a promiscuous and highly sexual woman. Also, to cover their tracks, the conspirators burned Catherine's body and created a fake story about her. They invented a fictitious lover, and they believed that he might be responsible for Catherine's death. One of the conspirators even sent a text message from Catherine's phone to this fictitious person, suggesting that she was on her way to meet him. However, forensic experts discovered that when the fire broke out, Catherine was only wearing her favorite nightgown, not an appropriate outfit to meet someone. Despite the evidence, Rafał refused to acknowledge his involvement in Catherine's death. Instead, he told Jane, Catherine's mother, that her daughter was receiving threatening emails and text messages from an ex-boyfriend who said if he couldn't have her, no one could. Rafał also claimed that Catherine had spoken of taking her own life. In a shocking display of deceit, Rafał allowed Catherine's parents to comfort him, believing he was also mourning the loss of Catherine he loved. Rafał's acting was incredibly convincing. After Catherine's death, her mother, Jane, was so taken in by his performance that she hugged him and allowed him to call her mom. Jane explained that in the early stages of the investigation, the police viewed Rafał more as a witness than a suspect, so she decided to offer him her full support. Her reasoning was that if Catherine had loved him that much and he was considered part of their family, then he deserved their support. The trial, chaired by Justice Sharp, began, and the jury heard that Reflissel and his two co-defendants stood to gain a significant amount from Catherine's death. They hoped to receive a life insurance payout of £123,000 and half ownership of a two-bedroom home in Mangold, Somerset, valued at £137,000 during the trial. It was revealed that when police found Catherine's body in her burned car on the morning of September 12th, Reflis showed no emotion. Anna Legwinowicz frequently shook her head and laughed in court when it was suggested she was responsible for the crime, but refused to testify. Teds also chose not to testify in his defense. The judge, Justice Sharp, told the defendants the murder was a horrific and merciless crime. The defendants showed no emotion during sentencing. The judge described Anna Legwinowicz's behavior as deceitful, manipulative, and cruel, and stated she played a significant role in the crime. He also told Tedepes that the murder was committed for gain, with many aggravating circumstances and no mitigating ones. The judge expressed deep sympathy for Catherine's parents, who had no idea that Rafał Novak's charming facade hid a monster. Rafał's actions were driven by financial gain, as he had no emotional ties to Catherine. Catherine's mother stated that the brutal and calculated manner of her daughter's death would haunt them forever. She regretted not having the chance to say goodbye or express her love, and now considers Rafał an evil person who deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison. Catherine's father, Philip, added that they had welcomed Rafał into their home, treating him like a son, only to be betrayed by him. During the trial, Rafał Novak became emotional in the witness box. He denied any involvement in the death of his girlfriend, Catherine Welsbear. Rafał claimed everyone was blaming him for a crime he did not commit. However, the court heard that Rafał showed no emotion when the police discovered Catherine's body in her burned-out car on September. Catherine's mother, Jane Welsbear, testified that after his initial release from police custody, Reflissel asked for a steak dinner and didn't even mention Catherine. Jane Welsbear stated that her daughter's fate was sealed when she and Rafał bought a house together and took out a life insurance policy. She believes that in signing the contract, Catherine also signed her own death warrant. Ultimately, the court found Rafał Novak guilty of suffocating Catherine with a pillow while she slept. He had conspired with his secret lover, Anna Legwinowicz, and her uncle to deaths to claim a £123,000 life insurance payout and a share of the house. Anna and Tadevs had transported Catherine's body in her car to a remote location and set it on fire. Rofel and Anna were sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 32 years, while Tadevs received a 27-year sentence. After the verdict, Catherine's parents, Philip and Jane Wells-Bear, advocated for stricter immigration laws. They believed that if the UK had more stringent immigration rules like the US, Rofel Novak would not have been allowed entry. Rofel had previously been convicted of assaulting his wife in Poland. Philip and Jane, who divorced after Catherine's death, blamed the European Union for the UK's lenient immigration policies. Jane stated that the UK does not thoroughly check people entering the country. She was unaware of Rofel's previous assault charge in Poland and believes the government needs to prevent individuals like Rofel from freely entering the country. Following the verdict, Catherine's mother paid tribute to her daughter, describing her as a beautiful, determined, and hardworking individual who earned a first-class degree from the University of Bath. Catherine's family expressed their devastation and loss, stating they were proud of her accomplishments and had no idea how to move forward without her. They believed she had great potential and a promising life ahead, but it was cruelly taken away from her and her loved ones. Heather, just 22 years old, had recently embarked on her college journey, settling into her job, and it felt like life was full of promise. Maple's smile and laughter were contagious, and her constant chatter filled the air. She radiated warmth and energy, uplifting everyone around her. Everything changed on January 7, 2015, when Heather Maples didn't show up for work. Her lifeless body was discovered in her apartment, partly unclothed. Who had the right to take Heather Maples' life? Detectives faced a challenging investigation because Heather had no enemies, and the motive behind this crime remained unclear. If not for one small detail, Heather Maples' death could have remained unsolved, and the criminal would have gone unpunished. On a typical morning at the real estate agency in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, on August 7, 2015, Kelsey Price arrived at work and began her usual tasks. Heather, her friend and colleague, was running late, which wasn't surprising to Kelsey as Heather was known for her lack of punctuality. Kelsey started calling Heather to wake her up, but received no answer. The previous night, Heather had planned to go to a bar with some friends and had asked Kelsey to come get her if she overslept or didn't answer her calls. Therefore, Kelsey wasn't concerned and went to Heather's apartment to wake her up. The girls' apartments were located in the same complex where they worked. Upon arriving, Kelsey found the front door unlocked. Easily entering inside, she saw her friend lying on the bed, sleeping on her stomach, wearing only a crop top and no underwear. Assuming Heather had a wild night, Kelsey tried to wake her up, but there was no response. She then tapped Heather's foot, attempting to rouse her from her sleep, which no one would ever interrupt again. Maple's foot was so cold that Kelsey literally jumped back in horror at the realization of what had happened. Kelsey Price, in horror, stepped out of the apartment and called 911. Soon, emergency services were on the scene. Detective Tommy Massey was one of the first to arrive at the crime scene, and the forensic team meticulously combed through the apartment. Heather was indeed partially undressed with signs of blows on her face. The hair of the poor girl was soaked in blood, which was also splattered on the walls. It was clear she had been brutally beaten, tortured, and actually assaulted. Massey and his colleague, Detective Maples, coincidentally sharing Heather's surname, recalled this crime as a horrifying nightmare. That's understandable as witnessing such a heart-wrenching scene is extremely difficult. Heather Nicole Maples was born on August 23, 1992 in Ocala, Florida. Her mother jokingly called Heather a hurricane baby. This nickname was entirely justified as many envied the energy and courage that Heather possessed. In February 2004, Jennifer Hunter gave birth to her second child. Heather welcomed a brother, Ryan, into her life with great joy. However, Ryan was later diagnosed with significant developmental delays, and the older sister of her own accord dedicated all her free time to him. She took care of him, happily spent time with him, taught him to speak, walk, and eat on his own. Heather was in the 7th grade at the time and devoted all the following years until graduation to Ryan. Showing immense love and dedication, the journey began with a call from her former classmate, Chaz, inviting her to join him in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where he studied. According to him, it was the perfect place for Heather, with a small college town where she could get a great opportunity to prepare for college. Heather accepted, And in January 2015, the future student went to Chaz in Murfreesboro. By the way, their relationship soon turned romantic. A completely different life began for the girl. With the support of her best friend, Kelsey, Heather found a job in the office of the residential complex where they lived. Maples was balancing work with her college preparations. Her friends and family supported her. Everything seemed to be going well. But soon, her relationship with Chaz began to crumble, which led to a breakup, and Chaz moved away. At the August, she excitedly called her mother to share this wonderful news. She had been accepted to college. Her mother, filled with pride, was thrilled for Heather's achievement. However, a week later, Heather failed to show up for work, sparking concern and uncertainty. The detectives understood that considering the nature of the crime, it could have been related to Heather's personal life. At that point, most of her friends were considered suspects, and frankly speaking, there were reasons for that. Upon examining the apartment, there were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that Heather likely knew her attacker and possibly let them in herself. After a thorough investigation of the crime scene, several important pieces of evidence were discovered. Unknown DNA and a hair that did not belong to the victim. All of this was sent for analysis to identify the suspect. However, the most significant piece of evidence was a clear bloody fingerprint on the right side of Heather's bed. Detective Massey explained that if someone had deliberately dipped their finger in ink and intentionally left their mark, it wouldn't have been so clear and precise. Of course, this print was sent for analysis as well. Additionally, Heather's mobile phone was found in the apartment, but without the password, accessing its contents was impossible. This is where Kelsey came in handy. She played a crucial role, not only helping with the phone, but also deciding to inform Heather's mother of her death, believing it would be better coming from someone who loved and cared for Heather. Detective Massey hoped to get a lot of information about Heather from her friend, Kelsey Price. He wanted to know everything about the victim's personal life, especially her relationship with Chaz. Kelsey told the detective that the relationship was quite tense as Chaz had obvious anger management issues. And sometimes, he was too aggressive and cruel towards Heather, so the girl decided to end the relationship herself. Therefore, the police immediately decided to investigate Chaz. But an unexpected turn of events occurred. A young man named Michael was determined to access the crime scene despite the caution tape. He had keys to Heather's apartment. According to Michael, on the evening before her death, Heather called him and invited him for dinner, which he accepted. Immediately after dinner, Michael went home, unlike Heather, who went to a local bar with friends. But later, Heather reached out to Michael for help. As Michael recounted, Heather was in trouble. A young man named Ortavio was bothering her and was quite aggressive. Immediately after the incident, Michael offered to drive Heather home. As per his statement, it was around 2:30 in the morning on August 7th, the last time he saw Heather. Additionally, during the interrogation, Michael mentioned that Heather's front door should have been unlocked because he had her keys since she was dressed in a dress and didn't have pockets to carry them, and he simply forgot to return them after unlocking the door. Michael was very disappointed and did not seem like a liar at all, but investigators had to take his fingerprints and a DNA sample. They also contacted the bar to obtain surveillance footage, which confirmed everything Michael had said during the interrogation. Analysis confirmed that the fingerprints and DNA found at the crime scene did not match his. After Michael was cleared as a suspect, investigators turned their attention to the man who had been with Heather that night, Ortavio. With Kelsey's help in unlocking Heather's mobile phone, interest in Ortavio significantly increased. Detectives discovered that Heather had messaged Ortavio, a friend of hers, inviting him to her apartment just hours before she was found dead. But why did Heather call Ortavio to her home after Michael had saved her from him? The answer was simple. They were friends and became more persistent than usual at the bar. Heather was caught off guard. She wasn't prepared for this. Now the detectives needed to speak with Ortavio to get his side of the story. Interrogation continued. The detectives intensified their questioning of Ortavio using a tough interrogation method that not every suspect could withstand. Ortavio was shocked by what he heard. It seemed he genuinely didn't know what had happened to Heather. Following the interrogation, he willingly agreed to a DNA test, confident that it would clear his name. The results proved him right as the DNA found at the crime scene did not match his, leading to his exclusion as a suspect. Without any leads, the detectives worked practically around the clock, reviewing surveillance footage, scrutinizing every detail provided by witnesses. On the 9th day of the investigation, as Detective Massey was preparing to leave the office late at night, he received a crucial call from one of the directors of the forensic laboratory. Massey finally got the answer regarding the bloody fingerprint that was lifted from Heather's bed. It belonged to a young man named Brandon Bowling, whose fingerprints were on file due to his employment at a company where he previously worked. This development prompted Detective Massey to approach the interrogation very gently, wanting to give Brandon a chance to explain what happened that night. The detectives knew he was lying because the fingerprint was fresh. It seemed that Brandon understood he was caught, but he continued to deny any involvement in Heather's death. After questioning, detectives requested a DNA test from Brandon, suggesting that if he was innocent, the test would prove it. Brandon did as he was asked, perhaps hoping to be released from police custody. But that did not happen. The investigators decided not to wait for the test results. The match of the fingerprint provided substantial grounds for the next step. The police immediately sent a request to the court for permission to access Brandon's phone, which could help the investigation confirm his movements, track calls, and texts on the night of the crime. However, they were unprepared for what they found on his phone after the court approval. The video from Brandon Bowling's phone was one of the most shocking even to the most experienced detectives. In this video, the room of the court Heather was captured. Brandon recorded everything from intimate acts to beatings. Heather was still alive at the time of the recording. In February 2018, Brandon Richmond Bowling pleaded guilty to the attack on Heather Maples. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison without the possibility of parole. On the day of the verdict, Heather's mother, Jennifer, made a speech that surprised many. When the trial ended in the corridor, Jennifer approached Bowling's mother. Jennifer simply hugged this woman, saying that they both lost their children that day. Unfortunately, Brandon Bowling never explained his motives. What are your thoughts on this? What do you think Brandon's motive was, if there was one? The young son of a woman named Yvonne Johnson was playing behind their Brookhaven trailer park house on Hurst Street in Opelika, Alabama on the afternoon of January 28, 2012, when he discovered a small human skull. Startled, the little boy ran inside to inform his mother, who then dialed 911. In a short period of time, authorities reached the location and retrieved the skull. They then spread out into the woods and discovered more human remains. Also, a pink long-sleeved shirt with heart buttons and ruffles was found. This was discovered next to a brook, but it was unclear to the investigators whether it was associated with the human remains. Following forensic examination, it was discovered that the bones belonged to an African-American girl between the ages of 4 and 7. In line with malnutrition, the results also showed that the young girl's bones were underdeveloped. She had an obvious abnormality to her left eye, which was presumably brought on by abuse, and there were indications that she had been physically assaulted before her death. The young girl suffered fractures to her ribs, shoulders, limbs, legs, and skull. She suffered more than 15 separate fractures from blunt force trauma in total. All these injuries had been incurred before she passed away. The girl's DNA was run through the missing person database, but no matches were found. The police soon appealed to the public for information. Unfortunately, there were very few tips, and after just 4 months, the case was closed. The unnamed youngster was later referred to as Opelika Jane Doe, or Juvenile Jane Doe. In an effort to get some urgently needed information, federal agents at the FBI office in Quantico, Virginia, used forensic imaging equipment to create a sketch of what the young girl may have looked like while still alive. The composite sketch was made public by the detectives. They had billboards up around the southeast and circulated the flyers widely online, urging anyone who may identify the young child to get in touch immediately. Investigators soon determined that Opelika Jane Doe had died between 2010 and 2012. However, after a former Vacation Bible School instructor at the Greater Peace Church in Opelika came across the sketch, she gave investigators a picture from 2011. She thought that Opelika Jane Doe was in the photos. They made public the church photos, which showed the young child with a defect in her left eye. She had black hair that was fashioned in little tight curls and was medium in length. The general population was prompted to reflect on the past and to examine whether they knew a little girl who attended the Bible school. According to them, Opelika Jane Doe usually appeared to have been slightly unkempt and wearing filthy clothes. She was described by the teacher as being quiet, solitary, and not particularly social with the other kids at the Bible school. Authorities tried to find her name in churches and schools, but they found nothing. They soon transferred Opelika Jane Doe's remains to the University of South Florida's Forensic Anthropology for isotope analyses after the images were made public. She was identified as being from the southeastern region of the country, most likely Alabama or nearby states. With no lead, the case went cold for 10 years. In 2022, detectives expanded their search for answers outside Alabama. They went to other states where the girl might have lived before her murder. They questioned residents and interviewed quite a number of people, showing them Opelika Jane Doe's possible photos to see if they could identify her. Luckily, there was a significant breakthrough in the investigation when authorities discovered 50-year-old Lamar Vickerstaff Jr. to be Opelika Jane Doe's father. Lamar Vickerstaff was born and raised in Opelika, but throughout his time in the Navy, he resided in a number of locations. He finally settled at Naval Station Mayport in Jacksonville. When investigators met with him at the naval installation to break the news of his daughter's death, he steadfastly refused to identify his daughter. His wife, Ruth Vickerstaff, was questioned by investigators, and she admitted she had no idea who his daughter was or who she might have been. She and Vickerstaff had tied the knot in 2006. The detectives did further investigation and discovered Opelika Jane Doe's real mother, who is 37-year-old Sherry Wiggins. Sherry disclosed to the police that in January 2006, she had given birth to a girl who went by the name of Amore Jovia Wiggins. However, after her visitation privileges were revoked, her ex-husband Vickerstaff and his wife were granted physical and legal custody of her daughter in 2009. Sherry Wiggins was able to provide investigators evidence that she had been paying Vickerstaff child support since 2009. According to investigators who looked through pediatric and school records in the communities where the Vickerstaffs resided, Amore Wiggins was never enrolled in school and was never reported missing. In January 2023, DNA testing made it clear that Opelika Jane Doe was actually Amore Jova Wiggins. On January 17th, Vickerstaff Lamar and his wife Ruth were both taken into custody. Ruth was charged with failing to report a missing child, while Vickerstaff was charged with felony murder and failure to report a missing child. Finally, after 11 years, Amore Wiggins' identity was finally buried with her. On February 27, 2023, hundreds of residents of Opelika and investigators came to honor her life. Detective Alfred White of the Opelika Police Department remarked, "We can finally put the right name and right face to her, and we don't have to call her Jane Doe anymore." Sherry, Amore's mother, was also present. In her words, she heartbreakingly said to her late daughter, "I didn't want you to have it hard, so I let your tiny hand go, thinking you'd be playing in a big backyard." Presently, Pompano City is a bustling metropolis with an annual violent crime rate of 7.29 per 1,000 inhabitants. However, due to a stagnating economy and population, Pompano Beach had the highest tax rate in the nation in the 1990s. The pace of life was slow, and there were roughly 2,886 violent crime victims for every 100,000 people. In the year 1994, Lillian Declo, then 89, could still enjoy Pomp and O Beach after a youth well spent, despite the area's high crime rate. In 1905, Lillian Declo was born. Lillian committed her youth to serving others, particularly through her work as a teacher and nurse. All those who knew her cherished her for her kindness, patience, and caring nature, including her neighbors, co-workers, her patients, and students. June Nicholas, Lillian's niece, was among the many people who cherished her. Lillian assisted in raising June, her siblings, and her cousins when they were younger. Lillian moved to Pompano Beach, Florida, to live out her twilight years in peace, with June taking care of her as she grew older and began to experience memory loss due to illnesses related to aging. Lillian Declo, who was 89 years old, was a shining example of a life well lived to everyone who knew her. Lillian retired to her yellow brick home at 1550 Northwest 7th Avenue, Pompano Beach, after years of serving her community as a teacher and nurse. She lived a fairly normal life there by herself until violence broke through the window of her bedroom and disturbed her peace. For Lillian Declo, Saturday, April 29, 1994, was just like any other, expecting a visit from her niece, June. Later that evening, she relaxed throughout the day in her pink and white checkered nightgown. As Lillian grew older, June took on the role of caregiver, visiting her regularly to see how she was doing and to offer assistance with housework, medication reminders, or just to keep her company. That fateful day, June showed up at Lillian's house at around 6 o'clock to see how she was doing and to drop off some groceries that she had gotten for her. She went into the living room and saw that Lillian was not there. June then yelled out her aunt's name to find out her location, but she got no response. June looked in Lillian's usual sleeping quarters, the first bedroom, but she was nowhere to be found. June followed the hallway and peered into the bedroom on the right. She became a little startled. Her Aunt Lillian was lying on the floor there, appearing to be deceased. June let out a cry and hurried back up the hallway to dial 911. When June's 911 call came in, 2 Pompano Beach Police Department officers responded, their minds buzzing with questions. An 89-year-old woman being killed in her own home was not a story you heard very often. Thus, it appeared to be an odd call. When the officers got to 1550 Northwest 7th Avenue, they were able to confirm Lillian's death. Lillian was found lying on the floor next to a floor lamp that had fallen over, and a phone that had its cord pulled out. She was covered in bruises and cuts that suggested she had been beaten. Towels and other clothing items stained with blood were strewn all over the room. In the room where Lillian's body was discovered, the officers also observed a broken window, which is probably where Lillian's attackers had entered. The residence had been pillaged. There had obviously been a violent struggle as Lillian fought for her life, judging by the several broken pieces of furniture scattered throughout the room. The shocking state of Lillian's body gave the impression that it was a crime of passion at first. Lillian's body was covered in contusions. She had fractures to wrist, nose, and ribs. In addition, there were bruises surrounding her genitalia, indicating that she had been assaulted prior to her demise. She had also been strangled, as evidenced by the bruises on her neck. After Lillian's autopsy, the Broward Medical Examiner's office determined that she had died from asphyxiation and a blow to the head. The attacker strangled Lillian with a telephone that had the cord pulled out, which was discovered next to her body. But there was no sign that Lillian's assailant had targeted her in particular, so it's likely that the crime was not motivated by passion. Lillian had no enemies because she was generally well-liked in her community. Lieutenant Flew Ellen of the Pompano Beach Police Department stated that the overall condition of the house and the crime scene suggested that the case was probably one of a burglary gone wrong. However, that was incomprehensible to Lillian's relatives, who were aware that she had lived alone and had no wealth worthy of losing her life. June remembered that at the time of the incident, Lillian had no more than $50 at the house. A gold wedding band was the only item that seemed missing after the house was searched. The last time the neighbors saw Lillian was when she went to buy a newspaper at around 6:50 a.m. that morning. But police officers interviewed them after gathering evidence from the crime scene to see if they had heard anything connected to Lillian's murder. Despite the fact that the murder happened in broad daylight, she appeared hale and hearty that morning, and nobody could remember seeing anything suspicious. Detectives had compiled a list of passable suspects in Lillian's murder within a few days, but not enough to warrant an arrest. In an effort to encourage witnesses to try and recall anything they may have heard or seen that could aid in the investigation, the police offered a $1,000 reward for information leading to the murderer of Lillian's identification. San Rucking, a spokeswoman for the Pompano Beach Police, also informed the media that the police were searching for anyone with information regarding the crime or the man who committed it. San Rucking stated in an interview with The Sun, "At this point, we are urging anyone who saw anything to call us. With the blood of a defenseless 89-year-old woman in their hands, some sort of human monster is rampant." However, despite the initial weeks of investigation and encouraging progress, all leads quickly dried up, and the case became cold. June Nicholas, meanwhile, was in mourning over the passing of her cherished Aunt Lillian. It was so difficult for her to move on without her aunt and without knowing what had happened or who had hurt her in such a way. June was affected by her aunt's demise that she had to take a full year off work. She was in too much pain to care for her children for a few months, so she had to ask someone else to watch them while she grieved. No matter how hard she tried, she was unable to shake the picture of Lily in lying motionless on the floor of her home. To make matters worse, the case was abandoned, extinguishing any possibility of learning the truth about Lillian's true fate. Lily UND Clough case was shelved and forgotten for the following 10 years, during which time there were no new developments. However, by 1999, Pompano Beach was receiving law enforcement services from the Broward Sheriff's Office. Taking control of every cold case in Pompano Beach was part of this. The 1994 murder of Lily and Declo was one of the cold cases that the detectives from the Broward Sheriff's Office reopened by 2004. The investigation was led by Broward Sheriff's Office Detective David Tisley. They re-examined evidence taken from the crime scene nearly 30 years prior, and looked through old case files, the NA databases, with the assistance of other detectives in the unit. The pink and white checkered nightgown Lillian was wearing the day she was killed was one piece of evidence that really stuck out. The nightgown contained bodily fluids from the male attacker, which they found when they sent it to the lab for additional testing. This information was possibly the most important piece of evidence in cracking the case. The police used a fluid sample from the nightgown to create a genetic profile, which they then entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, but they were unable to find a match. Once more, a potentially fruitful lead had vanished and the case was abandoned. To allow Lillian Declos's family to move on and find closure, Detective Tisley was adamant about wrapping up the case. Detective Tisley's perseverance allowed him to revisit the case in 2019 under the Broward Sheriff's Office's recently established cold case unit, even though it took an additional 15 years. According to Jennifer Parker, the criminalist from the Broward Sheriff's Office who was in charge of doing the DNA analysis of the evidence in the case, it didn't seem like anything would come of reopening the Declos's case. However, Tisley thought he could identify the person who left their bodily fluid on Lillian's nightgown because of advances in DNA testing technology. In 2021, the Broward County Crime Lab was able to obtain a more comprehensive DNA profile thanks to this new technology analysis. In order to perform a familial search of its offender database, Detective Tisley and his team requested that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement use the DNA profile. In other words, they compared the DNA profile to the database of individuals who had been arrested and registered as offenders. Using this method, the DNA profile is compared to potential first-order relatives such as a child, father, or sibling in the database. There was a match found by the search. The crime scene's DNA and the DNA of a known offender in the system were remarkably similar. The perpetrator was identified as the son of the man whose DNA was discovered on Lily and Declos's dress the day she was killed. Johnny Mac Brown was the name of this man. Johnny Mac Brown was 40 years old when Lily and Declos was murdered, having been born in 1954. He was a veteran of the Vietnam War and experienced PTSD. For Johnny, life after the military was not pleasant. He turned to drug use as a coping mechanism for his PTSD, which ultimately led to drug addiction. He struggled to find stable employment for a while due to his addiction and mental health problems. Also ended up on the streets. Johnny was never thought of as a suspect in this case or any other crime when investigators first started looking into Lillian's death. He was completely unnoticed. But when Johnny's DNA profile was matched by the police, it became increasingly clear that Johnny was most likely the person who had attacked Lillian on that fateful day. Additionally, police uncovered some vital information. Although Johnny lived a few miles away from Lillian in the early 1990s and early 1994, detectives were unable to apprehend Johnny for questioning because he had passed away. At the age of 56, he passed away from natural causes in 2010. Johnny was laid to rest in the South Florida National Cemetery in Lake Worth, Florida. In August 2022, the request of the Broward Sheriff's Office detectives to exhume Johnny's remains for analysis was granted by a judge. The detectives collaborated with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, the Palm Beach Medical Examiner's Office, and her forensic anthropologist, who dug up the remains and performed DNA testing on them. In order to obtain the most accurate result possible, the experts tested samples taken from John E. body in the Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Lab. Jennifer Parker, the criminalist in charge of the office, compared the results to the pre-existing DNA profile. Parker extracted a sample of John E. bone marrow for analysis. The tests produced a match between the sample discovered at the crime scene and the known DNA profile. According to the Broward Sheriff's Office, the DNA results indicated that the DNA from the crime scene was 66.8 trillion times more likely to belong to Johnny than to anyone else. With this solid proof, there was no question that Johnny Mac Brown was the murderer in Lillian Declos's case. However, that did not adequately explain Johnny's motive. The most plausible explanation for the entire incident appeared to be the previous assumption that it was just a case of burglary gone wrong. Gregory Toney, the sheriff for Broward County, stated in a press conference that it was probably an opportunity crime. The sheriff said he lived close by, only a few houses down. He broke into the house when he fell on hard times, became homeless, and developed a drug habit. He might not have realized she was by herself there. She was 89, though she appeared to be living alone because everything seemed to have been taken out of the house, and all the drawers were open. The Broward State Attorney's Office was shown all of the evidence that the police had gathered up to this point after looking over the case. The prosecutors then came to the conclusion that Johnny Mac Brown had something to do with Lily and Declos's death. The matter was resolved. While 28 years may seem like a long time to wait for justice, Sheriff Toney feels that justice is eternal. He continued, "So long as we are responsible for investigating these cases, we are going to continue to push for the necessary manpower and effort to make sure that we can bring closure to so many families who have been waiting for decades, time and time again, in the hope that they get some resolution." The family of Lillian Declo prayed for answers to the enigmatic circumstances surrounding their loved one's death for 28 years. They can now start moving on since they have at last found the answers they were looking for. June Nicholas, who discovered Lillian's frigid corpse years prior, expresses her gratitude to the Broward Sheriff's Office for their commitment and for learning the truth about her aunt's passing. She thinks her aunt can now at last sleep in peace. I'm sure she can sleep soundly wherever she is. We can move on. We can die peacefully because we are certain that her murder has been solved. Not much is known about his next case. 64-year-old Luis Massa lived in Orange County, Florida. In December 2016, his body was found in front of his car on his driveway in Terrell Road. He passed away due to blunt force trauma. Someone had hit him over the head using a large lawn ornament. Some of his rings and phone had been stolen. There was also a broken window in his house. This made investigators believe that Luis interrupted the burglary. Neighbors told investigators that a man jumped a fence after triggering the house alarm just before police arrived on the scene. Witnesses helped investigators create the composite sketch. Investigators also found that another burglary took place, less than a mile from Luis' home, a few days before his life was taken. Fingerprints were collected at a crime scene. Recently, these fingerprints were tested to see if it matches anyone in a Cody's database. This led investigators to Devin Hill. When questioned, he admitted that he took Luis's life. He was arrested on January 29, 2021. He is currently being held in an Orange County jail, without bond. In 1980, two unrelated women, Sandra DeFelice and Robin Brooks, were sexually assaulted and murdered just months apart. Then in 1996, another woman, Jasmine Porter, met a similar fate. These three cases turned cold and remained unsolved for many years. Las Vegas is the most populous city in Nevada. What many don't know is that it was initially a small town founded in 1905. With time, it experienced a population explosion and rapid growth and development in various sectors. Today, the city is famous for its nightlife, casinos, and many points of interest, which attract tourists from all over the world. Sandra was originally from the capital city of Idaho, Boise. However, she eventually moved out of Boise with her childhood friend to Las Vegas. In Las Vegas, Sandra and her friend decided that it was best they stay together as roommates. The house they lived in was a short distance from a local park, as well as the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department's downtown command center. This proximity to a police station offered some comfort and a sense of security to the two friends. There was another inhabitant in the house occupied by Sandra and her friend. This was Sandra's 3-year-old daughter, who she had with her boyfriend. To make ends meet in the new city, Sandra took up a job as a waitress at a popular restaurant called Sambo's Restaurant. Life seemed to be moving at a good pace for the 25-year-old mother, but things would soon take a different and very dark turn. Sandra had no idea that her life would come to an abrupt end on December 26, 1980. Post-Christmas festivity was still in the air, and no one living within the East Las Vegas neighborhood where Sandra resided would have expected a tragedy to occur. Around 9 p.m. on December 26th, Sandra's boyfriend decided to pay her a visit. On arriving at the house, he noticed that it was unusually quiet. Not knowing what to expect, he went straight to Sandra's room and was shocked to his core by the sight that greeted him. Lying face up on the bed was Sandra. She was dead and the walls were splattered with her blood. Her agitated boyfriend immediately sprung into action and called the police to report the incident. And in a matter of minutes, police officers from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department arrived. They determined that Sandra had been sexually assaulted, stabbed, and strangled to death. Sandra's daughter, who had gone to stay with her grandparents at the time, had not been around to witness the terrible scene. Sandra's family was devastated when they were given the news of her death. Investigators immediately commenced an investigation. Sandra's roommate was questioned, and she revealed that she had seen Sandra alive barely 2 hours before her death. At the scene of the murder, investigators were able to collect several dark hairs. They had been found on Sandra's stomach and were believed to belong to her killer. Sandra herself was blonde, so the dark hairs stood out. In addition, investigators also got their hands on several other items of evidence, and one of these included a drinking glass containing Kool-Aid. Upon further analysis, a fingerprint was discovered on the drinking glass, and it was not long before a match was found. The fingerprint belonged to a man by the name of Paul Newtall. He was immediately named as a person of interest. The investigation was moving quickly, and it seemed the authorities were making headway. However, they ended up being disappointed. Paul was brought in for questioning, but there was nothing tangible detectives could use to pin him to the murder. As it turned out, Paul was a close friend of Sandra's roommate. According to the roommate's explanation to the detectives, Paul had been at their residence the morning of the murder. She further explained that Paul had asked her to let him sleep in the house because he had nowhere else to go. She had declined, and her reason was that Sandra did not know him well. However, she later invited Paul in to wait for her while she got ready for work. She had told him they would leave together when she left the house. During this time, Paul helped himself to a glass of Kool-Aid. This perfectly explained why his fingerprint had been found on the drinking glass. The roommate also said that after she had gotten ready for work, she and Paul had then left the house. With this revelation, authorities had no choice but to let Paul go. He was deemed an innocent man. Authorities had no further leads after this, and as time went by, the case grew cold. It wasn't until February 2021 that the case would be reopened again. This reopening was prompted by a call from Sandra's daughter to the police department. She had asked for an update about her mother's death, and investigators decided it was high time the case was revisited. Upon a review of that investigation in conjunction with our DNA forensics lab, they were able to determine that there was additional evidence that could be submitted for processing using new DNA technology, Lieutenant Jason Johansson, who had investigated the case, said. The additional evidence that was submitted for testing was DNA that was found under Sandra's fingernails. This DNA had never been tested, and it proved to be the clue detectives needed to crack the case. The DNA was a match to a man, and this was none other than Paul Newtall. From the beginning, detectives had had their suspicions about him. But there was nothing they could do since the technology was limited at the time of Sandra's murder. And now, with the strong evidence, authorities knew they finally had him cornered. Paul was eventually arrested on October 27, 2022, at his home in Northwest Valley, Las Vegas. After Paul Newtall was taken into custody, my cold case investigators had the pleasure of making the one phone call that every cold case detective wants to make. Lieutenant Jason said during a news conference after Paul's arrest, "I am hopeful that in some way, shape, or form, this provides some sort of closure for the family," he added. Paul, who is currently 64 years of age, was slammed with charges including murder, sexual assault with the use of a deadly weapon, and burglary while in possession of a deadly weapon. A look at Paul's criminal history revealed that he had not been involved in any other violent crime. However, he had been arrested in the past for felony and drug possession. At the moment, it's still unclear what fate awaits him since his court case is still ongoing. There is also a concern that Paul might have impaired thinking and reasoning ability. Authorities believe that this might hinder him from understanding the charges against him. Due to this, he is being made to undergo a mental health evaluation.